Do you have piles of patterned paper scraps that you would like to turn into cards? Hi, I'm Jess from JessCrafts.com, and I'm here to help you make the most of your crafty supplies and time. So let's get making. Today I have a class that is so the format of the video is like a class, very structured, very clear in like do this, do that kind of stuff. And I'm going to offer a workbook with it. So if you've seen my free YouTube classes before, you'll see that you can follow along with the instructions in the video, or you can purchase the coordinating workbook and it will give you some supplemental materials that will allow you to craft more easily without the video, if that is better for you. So we're gonna take some piles of scrap patterned paper and make A2 size cards. I'm gonna give you 10 different ideas. And this class is going to be called Squaring Away Scraps, because we are going to turn all of these scraps into different sizes of squares and put those squares in different arrangements on cards so that it kind of like ties them together a little bit. I wanted to put them around a theme that would help people to use up their scraps. So this is a printed copy of some of the pages in the workbook. The final product might look a little bit different because I might substitute some photos and that kind of thing, but I just wanted to give you kind of an idea as I reference certain things in the workbook. And so we are going to need various scraps of patterned paper. The largest piece you need is 4 1/4 by 4 1/4. So it does take some larger scraps, but there are not many that are that big, and there's quite a few that are a bit smaller. These are primarily 6 by 8, like these were from 6 by 8 patterned paper packs, and I don't have a lot of scraps naturally in my craft room because I primarily use my paper busting templates, and they show you how to cut patterned paper and make cards without scraps. So when I'm doing my typical card making, I don't make scraps, but when I made the samples for this video, I did start with original, full sheets of 6 by 8 patterned paper, and that's what these scraps are. And I just wanted to be honest about that because I do get people who ask questions about like how to use scraps, and that's why I created this class, but I don't actually have a lot of scraps. So in some ways I don't feel like the person to go to about that because I've just geared my crafting a little bit different than that. So scraps of patterned paper, it says you need 5 sheets of 8.5 by 11 cardstock, but that's because you're gonna turn them into 10 card bases because there are 10 A2 cards in this class today. So basically you need 10 card bases and you can make them from 5 sheets of 8.5 by 11. White or other color cardstock, you absolutely can choose a different color if you want different color card bases. You're going to need a paper trimmer. I have my Swingline Guillotine paper trimmer. Please follow all manufacturer's instructions with all the tools you're going to use. This is a class for adults, so I'm trying to teach you how to make the cards, but it's important that you understand how to safely use all of your tools. And then I recommend a scissor. I don't have any like specific directions involving a scissor, but I think it's always useful to have on hand, or at least that I can recall, but I like to put it on the supply list because I feel like it comes up when you're crafting. Adhesive, you can get a tape runner. I use my Scotch ATG a lot. You can use liquid glue if you have a liquid glue that you feel like comfortably works with patterned paper. Some liquid glues will kind of warp patterned paper. So that's why I would say I recommend a tape runner, but it's completely up to you. And then I would suggest some coordinating ephemera because I'm going to tell you like, here's how to cut the patterned paper, and then I'm going to embellish them a little bit at the end, but you'll want something that's going to match. And these coordinating ephemera could be like, die cuts, like you go into your collection of dies and you die cut a bunch of things. You could go into your collection of stamps, stamp and color a bunch of things. I'm not really going to be giving advice on how to do any of that today. It's going to be very focused on the card layouts. But I did want to provide something for you because when I was working with these collections, I felt like a lot of them coordinated with these embellishments that I created. So I have these card toppers that I sell in my Etsy shop, and I wanted to use some of them today, but then I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if they came with the workbook? So when you purchase the workbook, you're gonna get 1 sheet of printable embellishments. It includes the ornament and the holly, and it's kind of like a sample because I do sell a card topper pack that includes the snowman, the trees, the ornaments and the holly, and then you can get them as like PNGs, so you can make them different sizes and stuff. But I wanted to give you like a little sample and also like something that you could use for your cards today if you didn't have anything else. And then you could cut these with circle punches, circle dies, or like a die cut. Like there's machines that you can scan them in and do that kind of stuff. I don't know how to do that. I cut them with dies. But then the other things I recommend are perhaps some kind of organizing tray for all of your scraps, or like I have this tray that I've put all my embellishments in. This is literally like a cardboard box that I've cut the top off of, so it doesn't have to be anything fancy, but just to kind of keep those scraps under control. And a scoring board and bone folder to make your card bases. Now again, since I'm saying coordinating ephemera, that could entail a lot of things. So you might be pulling in stamp sets and ink pads and all of that, but that's for the decorating side. And these supplies are really more for just the putting the patterned paper on the cards. Let's talk a little bit how I'm going to structure the class. We're almost ready to begin. I am going to show you the card sketch, talk about what kind of squares you're going to need to cut from your pattern paper, assemble the card, embellish the card, move on to the next card. There's going to be 10 cards. There'll probably be timestamps so you can, look at each individual card if you want to go back. This sheet in the workbook gives you a complete list of all the squares that you will need, and then each sketch page also tells you what squares you need for that sketch to try to keep things really organized. There's an example of the completed card because people do often ask for that. So I'm trying to respond and do things in different ways. Like here's a complete list of the squares and there's a breakdown version of the squares and things like that, just so that hopefully it helps as many people as possible. And so I'm not gonna just cut all of these. If you want to do that, you can, but then you don't know what sketch they're going to go on, if they're going to coordinate or whatever. So, that's up to you. I do also note which ones can be directional and which ones should be non-directional, because I'm going to turn some on their side, and I'll talk about that with each sketch. Like some patterned paper, when I say directional, I mean some patterned paper has a clear top and bottom. And so if I turn this on its side, it looks like it's on its side. And then also, there's a sheet that just has all of the sketches on it. The writing gets really tiny in those instances, but I just thought some people might find that a helpful reference to have on hand. One last thing before we get started. If you don't know how to make the card bases from cardstock, I have a video. I'll link it in the video description that specifically describes how to cut A2 cards from 8.5 by 11 paper. But basically, you're going to cut the paper in half and then take each of those halves and fold them in half. So hopefully that's helpful to beginner card makers. Again, more specific breakdown video in the video description. I've described it in other classes, but from here on out, I'm gonna assume you have 10 card bases. I think I'm technically holding 9 for anyone who's paying attention to details, but I'll have a 10th when I need it. So for card sketch 1, it says we need a 4-inch square, a 3-inch square, and a 2-inch square. I decided not to use any card mats on any of these cards. So they're cardstock mats. So it's just gonna be patterned paper. That might not be your personal preference, in which case you can figure out how to add cardstock mats. You can go a 1/4 inch bigger, things like that. I talk about that in many other ones. But since this is if somebody really just wants to bust through some scrap pile, I thought some cards that didn't include mats would go a little faster. So we need a 4-inch square, a 3-inch square, a 2-inch square. We need them to coordinate. I'm going to look for patterned papers that look like they have a 4 inches left on them, so that I could cut a 4-inch square out of them. This one looks like it has enough. It has a really simple background. I kind of like that because then I think to myself, well, when the next layer comes on of patterned paper, it can be something that, and so I cut it down to a 4-inch square. It could be something that is maybe a little bit busier. So I can pair a not so busy, not so busy pattern on them. I need something that's 3 inches. This one's 3 inches. It coordinates. I'm not going to overthink it. I do think it would be helpful to, before you start with this, if you're starting with bins and bins of scraps, go through and just collect some that maybe coordinate pretty well together to begin with. Oh, I'm just gonna pull all, and anyone that just looks Christmassy to me or something like that, which is kind of what I did. Partly because I want this video to focus on being helpful to you guys and not going too slowly in any of it. And so then I need a 2-inch square. I'm a little not sure about my plaid on plaid choice here, Might have looked a little cuter if I like did plaid in the center and plaid on the outside, but I don't not like it. So, and I'm pulling in a blue with the traditional like Christmas red and green. That's, you know, fine by me. You could use any of the other sides sometimes, especially if I'm working with double-sided patterned paper. If I have decided on them, sometimes I'll just play around and go like, okay, what if I did it the opposite way? What if I flipped some of the papers over? This case, I would get 3 plaids in a row, which actually I'm kind of like, you know what? Let's lean into it. Let's just do like plaid, plaid, plaid. So I'm not, as you can see, I'm not planning these cards really in advance because I want to make part of the instruction of this rather than just telling you cut papers to these sizes, which, you know, you could just see the sketch and do. Like I want to add some additional value to watching the class and hopefully trying to explain some of my thought process, how I pick patterns, how I decide if things go together will be helpful to some of you. So I'm gonna kind of center it from the top and bottom. I could move my paper trimmer, I could use this grid mat, and you know, honestly, it's pretty close to center without having used the grid mat, partly because I've been doing this for like 10, 15, a long time. So I'm like, I am getting better at centering things, but they're not always perfect. I put things down crooked. And then I did size these circles to about 2 inches. So if you want to work with some of the ones that were in there, like if you could use the pink one, it should get on there pretty nicely, or the little holly leaf. I think either one of those would be pretty cute. They do include sentiments. The ornament says, hope your Christmas sparkles and shines, and the holly leaf says, hope your Christmas is merry and bright. And so I could just pick one. I mean, I am covering up a fair amount of the blue, that last piece of patterned paper, with this embellishment, but I'm fine with that. And I like that if you're in the mood for quick and easy cards, what's kind of nice about these is it's a sentiment and an image all rolled into one. So sketch number 2 needs 1.5 inch squares times 6 and 1 3-inch square. These can be with directional patterned paper as they're all going to face upright in the end. So my thought is I'll pick something that I could get all 6 background squares out of if I have a big enough piece, but you could of course go with something that is smaller, and therefore you could cut different pieces of the background paper out of different ones. I have this stripe paper, and it looks like it's the same one that I used in the previous example, but that's okay, we can mix things up. I'm going to cut 1.5 inch squares if it's 3 inches wide, so I'll need 3 on each side, and therefore I'm gonna need to cut it to 4.5. I know these are a lot of extra measurements, but that's kind of because I'm trying to cut it from one sheet of paper without trimming this smaller than it needs to be. So I cut 4.5 by 3. That's going to get me the 6 1.5 inch squares that I ultimately need. So now I'll cut this in half at 1.5 inches. I will cut this to 3 and then 1.5, and I have my 6, or my first 3 squares, and then I'll do the same thing with this second sheet. 3 and then 1.5. Okay, then I need a 3-inch piece for the center, and I could just use the back of this because this is already 3 inches. These are going to coordinate, so if you have enough pattern paper, that's fine too, but there's also, this is like red stripe paper. It's super simple to use. I could also use the other side very easily, and that would pair well with red paper. I can mix it up, use the stripe side. This red paper looks cute with it. I think these Christmas trees, I think would work well. This is a simple green paper, so maybe I'll go with that one just to change things up a bit because it's just kind of similar to my previous example card. Okay, and then we can adhere all of these down. One of the reasons that I like to use my dry adhesive, or like a tape runner, is because, well, there's a couple reasons. One, I'm pretty quick at it. I've been doing it for a while. And I had to re-record some of this, so I'm like hoping I'm not repeating myself with anything, but also that I can move things around a bit. So if I am like taping down, I have to put adhesive on the back of all these little squares. If I were putting glue on them, by the time I got to the last square, the glue on the first square would probably be dry. Also, when I go to stick it on my card, once I stick something down that has liquid glue on the back, it's pretty much there. But I like a little bit of time to adjust things because I'm kind of making a guess on how to evenly space all of these things. I'm not saying measure 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch from the edge and then make sure there's a 1/2 inch between each one of them. Like, I'm just kind of like, put them 3 in a row, vaguely equidistant from each other and the sides, but there's a larger gap in the center. You know, like that's kind of all the specificness of where to place them, directions. And so if I place one down and I'm like, oh, that's way more crooked than I thought, or they don't line up, the top's a little to the left and the bottom's a little to the right, then I can pick something back up and readjust it when it has that tape runner on the back, and I have a lot less ability to do that. In fact, I'm noticing I'm so busy lining up this middle piece with the top and bottom that I'm not lining it up with the one across from it. And then I can, you know, you can even add a little extra adhesive as you need to. It occasionally will rip the card base or something like that. I try to be careful. Or when you glue it to the mat, like your workspace, because apparently that's something that I do. Then I can place this in the center, kind of touching the top and bottom, the tops and bottoms. And then I need to add an embellishment here in the center. That one probably works. It's kind of reminiscent of the holly leaves in the rest of it, so I think I'm just gonna go with it. I know that these embellishments have like this like pink and minty kind of green. I don't know if that's the right description for it, but I think sometimes other things can tie, like rather than just tying colors together, themes can tie each other together as well. So that's card sketch number 2. I'm aiming for about 5 minutes on each of these, so we'll see how that goes. Card sketch number 3, this is the first time you're gonna need something that's non-directional. We're gonna take this square and turn it on its side. So we're gonna want our 2.5 inch square to be non-directional patterned paper and a 4 1/4 inch square. So I'm looking for a big piece of paper that's only 4 inches. I need something a little bit bigger, although actually I could, well no, it needs to be square, so it doesn't matter, whichever way you measure it. This is big enough, so we can get a 4 1/4 inch out of this. It has this really, this Fa La La paper that's on the back has never been one of my favorite. It just feels a little too busy to me, so I think I'm gonna be using this side. So we'll cut it to 4 1/4 by 4 1/4. And then the other thing that we need, I want to be a lot less busy. I've kind of drawn back to this paper. It does have a solid on the other side. So even though it's from a patterned paper collection, occasionally you'll see a solid or a really close to solid paper on one side. This only needs a 2.5 inch square, so I am going to be trimming some off of this. If you feel like you're going to be frustrated by the fact that you're still having scraps at the end of this, because I'm basically creating more scraps while using scraps, then you might want to take a little more time to find something that's already measures 2.5 or whatever size on one of the sides. And then here we're going to be able to, again, just quickly add the adhesive to the back and an embellishment to the center. That's why I like having these circle embellishments super quick, because they have the sentiment with them. And we'll center that. You can take it, use your grid mat or something. Sometimes you'll notice, you're like, I cut both of these things to 4 1/4. Why does it sometimes seem like one of them is bigger? One, I want to mention, there are sometimes like variations in manufacturers, like size measurements. So, you know, maybe the cardstock said it's 8.5 by 11, but really it's like 8 3/8 instead of 8.5, or something like that. And so you're measuring thinking that it's 8.5, and so when you do a subtraction measurement or something like that, it gets a little bit off. But you can always do what I did there. I just trimmed that little bit of extra off because I thought they were both 4 1/4, but who knows. So also, if you don't have a big 4 1/4 inch piece for, say, this sketch, or some of the, like any of them, if they're a little bit off, you can adjust things. So if you imagine that you just used a 4 inch square, it would, you know, there wouldn't be as much border around this diamond type piece, but it would still work. And you could also consider making the diamond piece a little bit smaller. And then we can add an embellishment here, tie in the pink with this little snowman, or actually maybe it would be even cuter with the ornament to really kind of emphasize that there's some pink in the background there. Sketch 4 needs 3 1 3/4 inch squares. So this 0.75 represents 3/4. I have just started thinking in decimals, but then I a lot of times will say them as fractions, and I kind of hope that like doing that will clarify for those who are like more used to decimals. Seeing the numbers will help. Those who are more used to the like saying the fractions will be helpful. But yeah, I mean, I've gotten a lot more comfortable with fractions since starting to try to figure out how to cut papers exactly and that kind of thing, certainly, but I know they can be a little bit tricky sometimes. So anyway, I want to find, like, this piece is 2 inches. It's super cute, and I could cut all the squares I need out of it, but then I am leaving myself with a scrap, so I'm kind of, I have a lot of bigger pieces still, partly because, like I said, I kind of had to make scraps to make this work, just because it's not my style of card making to make scraps, but, okay, and then this is still also 2 inches, so I guess we're just gonna do it. There are lots of ideas out there for like what to do with strips, and that's actually another like class idea I have. I'm like, what are a bunch of cards you could make with like random strips? Like how could you put them in different arrangements and that kind of thing? Because I think that's another common type of scrap people have. Like there's certainly, you know, large scraps. There's a part of me though that would tell you, you know, sometimes it's okay to just let that amount of patterned paper go. But up to you. And also you could put them on the inside of cards. That's a suggestion I see often, is that like if you just have a little bit of a piece of patterned paper left, people don't even put it in their scrap pile. They just put it on the inside of their card, and then they're not left with that scrap. So just as like a little bit of a kind of pull a card over and show you, like they might take a small scrap and just like put it in the corner, or layer a couple of them up. Like trying to just pull some scraps for you real quick, like, oh, if I put, you know, this one down and then layer these up and just like have a little decorative thing here in the corner. That's a good way to use up those teeny tiny scraps. So maybe I'll do some of that at the like off camera at the end. Okay, we're running out of time with this. We want to be quick with our sketches here. Okay, so you could use either side. You could mix and match them if you want. I think I'm going to use the darker side because they happen to just have like bigger amounts of the trees. And again, you can place these in order such that like it looks like the trees would, if you push them back together, they would connect. Or you can try to mix up the order so that it doesn't look so matchy-matchy. Bring in your card base. Going to place this right alongside the top. You are putting the pattern paper right up against the top edge. And the bottom edge, I'm laying this bottom one down very lightly so that I can get the spacing right and then adjust it, because it is definitely a little to the right than I want it to be in the end. But it can be kind of tricky to go across that gap and line things up. So now I'll pick it back up and line it up there. And I chose to kind of mix mine up so they don't look like a puzzle piece, like you can't put them back together. And then I'm going to finish up card sketch 4 with another one of the circle card toppers. This time I have mounted it on a cardstock mat. I'm not using many of those in this video, but I just thought, especially with it overlapping all of this white space, it needed something to help it stand out a bit. And in general, this card sketch does have a fair amount of white space. If that's not really your thing, I do have a video that I will link in the video description that gives you ideas for how to fill some of this white space. I think something as simple as a colored card, a card base instead of a white card base, can make a difference, but I also have some other suggestions in that video. Sketch number 5 is a little bit tricky. It has a lot of smaller pieces compared to some of the other ones. Like some of the other ones are like super quick, super fast. This one has some smaller squares, and it does require quite a few of them. It needs 3 3/4 inch squares, 1 1 inch, 1 1 1/4 inch, 1 1 and 1 3/4 inch, and one 2-inch. So it was like a lot to say. And they all have to be non-directional because they're all gonna be turned on their sides. You are cutting some relatively small pieces, so, you know, again, be safe and careful with all of your tools. Follow the directions that require it to be safe. I have a piece that is 3/4 inch wide here, and in order to make it a little bit easier to cut, I'm actually just gonna cut 3/4 inch off the end here. So I'm going from 7 to 6 1/4. And then another 3/4 down, and again. And then that way I'm not trying to fiddle with a tiny piece over here. So that's just my personal preference. And I've created the 3 1/4 inch squares that I need. I need a little 1-inch square. This is already 1 inch in one direction, so I'm gonna cut it off of there. Then I need a 1 1/4. Looking at this one's already 1 3/4. I do need a 1 3/4 inch, but this is directional pattern paper, so never mind. Let's see. This is 1 1/2, and I don't need a 1 1/2. I said so many numbers, I can't remember which numbers I said. That's also 1 1/2. I might go ahead and use one of these at some point. This is a 2-inch square, and I do need a 2-inch square, so maybe I will just make use of that. Although it's kind of, I mean, then it's pulling in a blue color. That could be nice. I need this is 1 1/2, again, 1 1/2. It's like I keep picking one because I'm like, ooh, I think that looks like it's the right size. Here we go, 1 1/4. I finally found one of the sizes I need. So we're gonna come in and cut the other side to 1 1/4. I'm trying to start with patterned paper that already has the measurement that I need on one side, just so that I'm creating less of those like little scraps, kind of like this one. We already talked about an idea. You can go ahead and put those on the inside of cards, or you can just toss them, and that's fine too. But this is like, preventing as, you know, as many of those as possible. Okay, I still need the 1 3/4 inch. At this point, I might just like give up and pick something that is bigger and cut it down, because that's also totally, oh, here, 1 3/4. So again, it's more blue, but that might help us. I like this one. It has, the other side has blue with the red. Let me make sure this is the right, it's technically a little bit under, it's not a perfect square. I'm gonna be okay with that personally, but totally up to you if you want to be more exact. This is one where you're gonna wanna look closely at your sketch. I personally am going to choose to use the tape adhesive because it's easier to pick up, like I mentioned before. If you do want to use glue, this is certainly an instance where I recommend really knowing where you're going to place everything and being confident about it, because it's a little bit of a tricky thing to do. It's not like the most straightforward sketch where you can be like, all right, I'm just going to line these all up and, you know, it's going to work out. This is a little tricky. Although, what I like to do with this sketch, and not that I've done it that many times, but I've, you know, practiced a few times to make sure all my numbers and math make sense and everything. I like to start with the biggest piece first. So I'm going to start with that 2-inch square in the bottom, and I'm kind of going to put it equidistant from the edges of the card because that's what I decided here in the sketch. And then I'm going to go to the next biggest piece, which is the 1 3/4 inch square. And I'm going to know that it says to kind of just extend it a little past that 2-inch piece. So I'm going to try to mimic that. Then go to my next biggest piece, which is my 1 1/4. And kind of look again, what's the relationship between the one I just placed and the one I'm about to place? Because I think the most common thing that would happen in this card that might cause you to be like, oh, it didn't quite turn out the way that it looks in the sketch, is if you make these gaps that there are in the sketch bigger by putting things further and further away from each other. So now when I put this here, it keeps a small little gap here, which is kind of the intention of the sketch. And we'll put one up here in the corner. And these ones I could just come in with some glue, easy peasy, because they're the last things that I'm placing. They're not placed in proportion to other things. And also here, I could wind up creating kind of a large gap, but this one that's where I'm gonna recommend to put the sentiment or embellishment. But of course, that's totally up to you. So that's why I was kind of prioritizing that one. But you can adjust these, especially if you don't want to put your embellishment there at the bottom. And we'll glue these last two on really quick and pick a embellishment to go with them. I'm thinking maybe I want something that ties in the red. I like that the way these little squares are arranged, and something I considered about them is that it makes a visual triangle. So you can make them all matching like I did, or you can make them different, but it gives you an opportunity to sort of like pull things together while using like a variety of scraps. Okay, and then I think the snowman looks pretty cute. He pulls in a little bit of the blue and the pink. I don't have any red in these embellishments, but I could also go to that other pack of embellishments. You could put a mat around it if you want, and finish off your card. Sketch number 6, we're gonna make up for some lost time because that last card definitely took a little bit longer. We are going to need 1 3.5-inch square and 3 1.5-inch squares. I thought that one might be 3.5, it's not. So moving on, this is really close to 3.5, so I'm gonna start with this. I don't love the back, but I'll use this side that's showing with the florals and berries and all that going on. 3.5, did I just cut the other one wrong? I may have. Yes, I cut it to 3 1/4. Oh no, that totally happens to me all the time. What a bummer. Okay, this is 3 1/4. Hopefully I now still have a big enough scrap. Okay, there, that one's 3.5. Now let's pay attention and cut it correctly. 3.5. Okay, and actually this one's super great for this background because it's a really large piece and we're gonna layer a piece of pattern paper right over it. So we want something that like isn't terribly busy. And so then I'm looking for maybe something that's already 1.5. This one is perfect. And then I will cut, see if I can get 3 1.5-inch squares out of it. I've got 2, I cut it to 3 and then to 1.5. And then this looks to be enough. Cut one more at 1.5. Okay, so then we can arrange them like that for the card. I think that you can also use, there's like this side, but I think I like the berries more. This side also, this one also has a plain side, but I want to show off some pattern. Like I love patterned paper. I usually want to be taking advantage of it and not using the plain sides, but sometimes they're certainly what is most convenient. Okay, put this on our card base. We're gonna center this one. A lot of these sketches you can turn either way, so I'm showing this as a landscape sketch here, but you can instead change it into a portrait card if you would like by just kind of turning it on its side. This works either way because it's non-directional patterned paper, but if you had directional pattern paper, you want to decide which orientation you want before you start laying everything down. And then we can just add in some kind of embellishment. I am thinking that this one, because it's primarily red, that I don't know if any of these, I don't know if I like any of these very well with it. Although I think the berries, the holly berries would probably be the closest because there are some kind of berries going in the background. The snowman does seem to look cute with everything though. So we'll add an embellishment and be done with sketch number 6. Sketch number 7 is a quick one. We're gonna need 2 2-inch squares and 1 2.5-inch square. The 2.5-inch square is turned on its side, so it needs to be non-directional patterned paper. I'm again gonna start by looking for this one's 2.5 inches. I know I just used this patterned paper, but I'm just grabbing what I see first in my pile. I have my box right over there to the side. Then I need some that are already 2 inches. Oh, that's 1.75, so it's not what we need. Let's see what else I've got really quick. This one I think was a 2-inch square, but I will say kind of the point of this is that it will look like one continuous piece here, but you don't have to have one that is the size. So I probably want my top and bottom to match, so I'm kind of looking for something that is 2 inches and is also taller so that I can cut both pieces that I need out of it. But I'm not seeing anything that is obviously like the right size, so I can start cutting down a larger scrap and maybe thinking about some paper that, like a scrap that I really like and want to make good use of. I mean, that snowman, I haven't got a chance to use them yet, and that could look really cute. So, and I can use the solid red side. And here I'm kind of choosing that, like, in order to make this busier pattern work, then maybe I don't use this patterned side. So like I kind of said, like I prefer to use patterns when possible and not the solid sides, but those solid sides can be really useful for those times when you know, have one paper that is a little bit busier than another. Okay, put it here on our card base. You could, of course, if you're creating these and you want to just cut a piece that is the continuous length, it would be 2 by 5.5. So if you just have a 2 by 5.5 inch scrap and you would rather use that and just put it all along here, absolutely go for it. I was just, you know, trying to kind of experiment with what I could do with squares only. And that's a kind of a trick that I like to use a lot with my paper busting templates so that we can kind of extend the paper a little bit and not create scraps, is by getting kind of clever about how to piece things back together. And then I don't think I want to put the snowman because it's a different style than the other snowmans, but I don't know, it looks pretty cute. We could always go back to the ornament. That certainly works pretty well in this situation. I like the tree kind of pulls in the green a bit more though, so I think we'll go with the tree. And then we have sketch number 7 finished. Sketch number 8 needs those 1 3/4, 1.75 times 6. And I know earlier we cut some and then wound up not using them on things, so maybe this is a good time to bring back some of those pieces so they're not going to waste, and also looking for some other things that are around that. Let me make sure this is the one. Yeah, I thought this was one of the ones that I didn't get to use earlier. So looking for anything that's starting off that size. Seeing, I think there's like a blue one somewhere. No, that was a 2-inch one. Oh, it's this one. So maybe we can see if we have more pattern paper of that same design or similar, pull a few more out of it. I have that. That's also 2 inches. So I'm going to start by going, okay, well, I do have more of this particular patterned paper, so maybe I'll only mix 2 patterns. That's what I chose to do on the other example, is rather than, I could choose 6 different papers. Absolutely, that could be super fun. If that's more your style, go for it. Or you can try to keep it a little bit more matchy by just picking like 2 and going back and forth between the 2 of them. So we're gonna cut 2 more out of this Christmas tree paper. And then I do have a little bit more of this red plaid paper as well. So we will cut 2 more pieces of that as well. And then you can choose whether you want to match them with like 2 pattern sides that might be a little bit more bold, or we could flip it over to the red side that just has those teeny tiny stars to kind of bring it back a little bit and, you know, make it not so busy. I'm also looking to see like which of these has like the cuter sets of trees. I'm really partial to this side of this patterned paper personally, and then I like patterns, so I'm going to go with the plaid side, so then I can turn them all over and add adhesive to the back. We're going to be putting them up against the edge of the cards again, so we need to keep that in mind as we're trying to keep things spaced out. Again, another time where if you're using liquid glue, you're going to want to be careful because you're trying to line things up across a card base. And something that you might find helpful is doing something like taking a T-square ruler and using that to help you to line something up straight across. So once we decide how far we want it down from the top or bottom, we can use the T-square so that it will hold it straight across. That kind of makes it easy. A regular ruler can do as well, but it kind of helps to make sure that things are square. And you could also line it up with your grid mat, but the grid mat, you'll only be able to see those on the edges. So I'm going to kind of use both, and I'm going to make sure I'm like kind of giving it enough space here at the top. Okay, so I can put it in the corner there, and then what I usually like to do is go to the other side first, and I can know that these should line up because of the T-square ruler, and then I'll come in with my center one, and now I will eyeball center it between the other two patterns. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. So I'll start off by putting the center piece in and thinking, okay, these are all about the same. They look pretty good to me. Bring my T-square ruler down here to the bottom and use that to make sure the other two pieces are straight across the bottom. So I didn't put T-square ruler as a supply, but there's an example of how it could be helpful, and maybe I'll add it as like an optional supply in the, you know, the list. And then, sorry, I didn't get that quite against the edge there, and you just pick out a embellishment to finish it off. Card sketch number 9 is a pretty quick one too. It needs 4 1.5 inch squares and 1 4-inch square. So it does need a bigger piece though. And you're going to be putting some of the pattern on top of another one. So I generally suggest for that large square, if you can find a pattern that's a little bit less busy, that would be my preference. Also, the other thing you could do is if you did pick a busier patterned paper for the background, picking a really simple one for the foreground squares instead, but my preference is to make the less busy one the background of sorts. This is a 4-inch square. Both sides of this are pretty, like this side is pretty plain. It just has the snowflakes, but when you cover them up, they might look a little odd if I cover up most of the snowflakes. I think this side will also work well for a large background there. And then we are going to find, I would probably try to pick the same 4 squares. I would try to cut 4 squares out of the same patterned paper for these, but this is supposed to be scrap based. So like, that's what I'd probably do in an ideal situation. However, that's not necessarily what we're working with. So maybe I'll look for a variety and see how we can kind of make that work. So I have that one. That one's already 1.5 inch, so I don't have to cut it any more. This one, I mean, I don't think that that works very well, but I could use just the green side and kind of give you an idea of what it will look like, you know, like does incorporating a solid piece. And also you could, I wanted to say this earlier, but I forgot. Some people have asked like, okay, this is cool. Like I get, you know, like how to use my pattern paper scraps from some of your ideas, but what about my cardstock scraps? Because I actually do make a lot of cardstock scraps in my craft room. I use them for fake foam tape. Those of you who followed me for a while are probably familiar with that. And that's where I just take 2 bits of cardstock and glue them together. And then I can use it to like pop something up. My example of it is really hard to get to right now. It's like covered in a bunch of stuff. So I'm trying not to drop everything in my craft room. But like taking 2 layers of cardstock, gluing them together. If you have thin cardstock, you can glue a couple more layers and you can use that to pop up things like embellishments. But the other thing is you could just be doing this with plain colored cardstock. It doesn't have to be patterned paper, or you could be mixing some of it. Like you could be cutting this 4-inch square out of a solid scrap of cardstock and then using your patterned paper and, you know, looking at the different sketches and choosing how to do that. This is a 1.5 inch square. Now this is actually not Christmas paper. This is just another random scrap I had, but I'm kind of like, well, can I make it work? It's a pretty simple pattern, so probably. And I'm trying to find just like one more so I don't have to cut down another patterned paper, but I don't know if I have a 1.5 inch. Oop, I think I got, did I get lucky? Yes! Okay, these are some really bold choices of patterned paper. These are quite different. But, okay, so this one to me is kind of most the well, these two are most the outlier because these are very simple pattern papers. And I do think that's a good thing to consider, right? Like that mix of how do we make this work is to go with some bold choices and some simple choices. So I could turn this over and then they're both stripes. That's perfect. I can't believe it worked out that easily. I was like, how are we gonna make this work? And that was the perfect solution. But as you can see, like the berry side or the candy cane, I did it again. I said candy corn instead of candy cane in another Christmas video. It's farther away from Halloween, but I guess candy corn's on my mind. Okay, so, and I don't actually like candy corn. If I had to pick, I think I would pick to eat a candy cane instead of candy corn. What about you? If you're following, if you got to this point in the video, which hopefully you did because I'm hoping that I'm providing enough interesting tips, but would you rather eat candy corn or candy cane? A candy corn or a candy cane? And then, again, we're just gonna find an embellishment for the center. We could pull in the pink. I would probably pick something that has a little bit less of the pink though, so that like I'm not favoring too much one of the two stripe papers. You can also make your stripes go in the same direction. I'm sure some of you wish that I had done that. Some people really like their stripes to all go the same way, and I totally get that. But yeah, then we would just put down our embellishment. And also I could have switched, I kind of totally forgot to check on the blue side of the pattern paper once I picked all of my front patterns, but I think the green's probably good. It makes it stay in the Christmassy space. And then we just kind of center that between the top and the bottom. Again, this is one of those ones that could go either way. I could just take this whole thing and flip it into a portrait style card instead. We've made it to card sketch number 10. Hopefully you've been using up a bunch of different scraps, having fun, really just exploring that pile of scraps that you have collected over time. Card sketch number 10 is going to need 12 1¼ inch squares. And these, in my example previously, I used a bunch of different patterns. I think this is a great time to use a bunch of different patterns, and I can share a little bit why I think it works so well in this particular sketch. But I'm just gonna start going through and finding some pieces that I can cut down to 1¼ inch squares. That's gonna be pretty easy to do, because especially if you have any bigger scraps, but you can certainly start by going through your scraps and seeing, hey, is there anything that's already 1¼ that happens to be? That was pure luck right there. And I again prefer, so it's gonna be a little bit easier. I'm like, okay, this is 4¼ cut it to 3, take another 1¼ inch off of it. And you can cut a bunch from the same piece of patterned paper, or you can, cut 1 square each from pattern paper. This sketch needs 12 of them. They can be directional, so you don't have to worry about that. So you could just go through and kind of just cut a whole bunch of scraps up to this size if that works for you, and then make multiples of the card. I think the reason that this one works well for if you have a variety of patterned papers is because while there is a lot of busyness from combining multiple patterns, because you're turning it into a grid, it kind of brings some order to that, the variety. So instead of being like, oh, there's so much to look at, this is like really, really busy, because it's lined up and put in a grid, it gives off the impression of being less busy. And so I don't know if I have 12 yet. I know I didn't cut them all on camera. For whatever reason, I was just having like a hard time being concise in my thoughts for this particular one. But even if I cut multiple, that doesn't mean that I'm only using one side of the pattern paper. A lot of these do have double-sided. Some of them don't. These like random blue and yellow scraps that I have are single-sided. And I think this is another one where, again, if you have a bunch of cardstock scraps, you could mix those in with your patterned paper, or this is a fun one where you could just, you know, if you just cut these out of different, like a rainbow of cardstock colors or something like that, it would be still a super cute sketch. So we can use glue on this one, or we can go with the adhesive runner. Again, like, I don't want to discourage anybody who feels more comfortable with the other one. I just want to kind of point out the pros and cons. I do want to think about how, if I'm going to like use, say, 4 blocks of blue, or 4 blocks of the same color pattern, whatever, I don't probably want to put them in a row, unless I'm doing something like if I have 4 of 3 different ones. You know, like I'm going to put all of the pattern of this, like all of these the same pattern, all of these the same, like maybe that would make sense. But if it's going to just kind of be mixed throughout, I'm going to want to say, okay, let me maybe put them opposite each other, put one at the top, one at the bottom, that kind of thing. So I'm actually starting with some patterns that I have multiples of, so that I make sure to spread them out and I'm not at the end going like, oops, I forgot to, you know, glue on any of those 3 or any of the 3 brown plaids, and so now they all have to go next to each other or something like that. And for these ones where there's 2 sides, you might want to stop and think, okay, you know, of these 2, which one works better for the snowman? Like, I like that one as a snowman paper, but this one, like, it's not, there's only one snowman face. I tend to think about that. Like, if you, especially if you have like a critter, an animal, in this case, I don't know, creature? What would you call a snowman? A face. If there's a face on it, I'm gonna prefer to see more faces. And I think starting in the corners can be helpful. These 2 are both pink, so I can kind of balance those out with each other. Even if they're not the same paper, I could consider that. I'm gonna put the candy canes, and I said it right the first time, in this top corner. If you have like super big patterned paper, that is the other thing about this brown plaid, is it is houses on the other side. And so unless I got really lucky and cut a complete house, I'm not sure I'd want to use that side. So you do want to think about probably not cutting down your really large scale patterns for this particular one. Even a pattern paper like this, there's a lot of times where if you cut a 1 1/4 inch square, you could wind up not cutting anything interesting out of that patterned paper. I thought like I looked at this one and I was like, well, if I cut it down like this, then you would see most of a holly leaf, so maybe it would work, but it's just, you know, I like to think about those kind of things. I think the Santas are another one that don't work well, because 1 1/4 inch, and if you want to measure this beforehand, if you want to get an idea before you start slicing into a piece of paper, I would just take a ruler and think like, what does, you know, measure out 1 1/4 and go, okay, well, if I cut 1 1/4, am I gonna like that? You know, maybe I like this particular one, but then that one's just gonna be part of a Santa hat or something like that. So you can envision it before you cut it out. Okay, so once we start in the 4 corners, then I can go to the center, or I can go to the top and bottom. So this is where I'm gonna have to be a little bit careful, because I need there not to be like a bigger gap between this row, like these 2. Like I want this gap, and that gap to all be similar. Okay, and once I've kind of started the grid, I can then kind of build out from other pieces of the grid, but that's why I find it helpful to start in the corners, because they're giving me like kind of anchors to put the next pieces, and then I can continue to glue this entire grid and place a sentiment. I would again probably prefer to place it in the bottom right-hand corner personally, because I think that again leads your eye into the card. And what I mean by that is, particularly in English, we read from left to right, top to bottom. So when we're scanning something, we kind of start at the top and go towards the bottom, and then once our embellishment's there, we get to the bottom, we see the embellishment, and then our next step is like, okay, the next thing we do is open the card, because that's what we do when, you know, we get to the bottom of a page in a book or something, turn it in. So I think that's why we tend to go towards that bottom right-hand side as opposed to like the top left-hand side for our sentiment, although that's fine too if you like the way it looks, but just kind of understand like why, if that looks weird to you, or, you know, that's so, yeah. And maybe you want it in the bottom right, just so you don't have to watch me glue forever. I adhered those last kind of, again, just following the grid. These are not perfectly lined up by any means. You can go in with a T-square ruler and try to make sure that they are, but I think that even though I know they're not perfect, kind of like from far away, or if you're not scrutinizing it too much, they look totally fine. And so I just want to point that out, because I think sometimes we get a little bit caught up in what we think is a mistake, and it's just not a big deal to anyone else. I hope you've enjoyed this step-by-step way to use a bunch of the scraps that you might have collected over the years. I've made some Christmas cards with them today, so if you have Christmas scraps, that'll be perfect. But I think this can be used for absolutely any occasion. You can see that you can even mix in some of scraps for an occasion with some of your, like, you know, maybe you have some birthday scraps and Christmas scraps, and you can kind of mix and match them. So you can get the workbook. If you like. I try to go slow enough that you don't need it, but it'll give you, you know, like the supplies that you needed. It will give you a list of all the squares. It'll give you some like directions with some pictures alongside. And then of course you get each sketch, the squares you need, the example card. So you have all of that, but you know, feel free to like pause the video and write down this information. I tried to make sure that everything was like on screen long enough that you could do that if you would prefer to. And remember that you can also turn a lot of these the other way. I kind of just picked one way or the other, but a lot of the sketches work in both directions. Got that one mixed up. And I hope that this has been, like, there's been enough tips and tricks, because I know this takes a little longer to kind of show you every step, but hopefully that has added some value. There's all the card sketches at the end, and of course the printable embellishments. You'll get a PDF sheet that looks like this, so they'll be already pre-sized to 2 inches, but if you want to be able to size them bigger, if you want some of the other designs like the snowman and the Christmas tree, you could purchase the card topper pack and you will get those. There's also a more like red and green sort of traditional Christmas colors pack that has some different images in it and different sayings, and you could pick that one if that's better. But also there's like card toppers for other occasions in the Etsy store as well, if that's what you're working on. Just want to give you some options there. If you found this video helpful, here's another video where you can find more ideas for enjoying your crafty time and supplies. Let me know you like this video with the share to your crafty community. Subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the next template or tutorial, and check the video description for product links. See you in the next video.